Hey gang, welcome back. Welcome to Module 6. So this is going to be a really good one, I promise. Our first lecture in Module 6, Lecture 6.1, is going to focus on a really important conceptual idea, that of the ecological niche. In preparation for your first case study of the course, which is focused on managing black bears in urban environments on the east coast of the United States, right out of the gates, I'm going to implore you to think about how mammalian ecological niches are changing as we rapidly transform both the ecology as well as the evolutionary processes of life on planet Earth. I'll return to this later in this module, but for now, in short, we have left the stable epoch of the Holocene, the time period within which human culture as we know it evolved. Our modern agricultural systems evolved. We have left the Holocene and we have entered a new geological epoch deemed the Anthropocene. Named as such because Homo sapiens are now the primary drivers of eco-evolutionary processes in the natural world. As you will soon discover, there will be winners and losers in the age of the Anthropocene. Those species that can expand their ecological niches to live alongside us and exploit resources within the world that we have created, they're going to win in the coming centuries, whereas many of our specialists and other species will not. For example, the greatest density of leopards on planet Earth is not in a national park in Africa, as you might expect. The greatest density of leopards on our planet is in the outskirts of Mumbai, India. That's a city of 24 million people. It's more populous than New York City, than any city in the United States. And leopards are thriving on the fringes of Mumbai. They're living on feral pigs. Our domesticated swine that has escaped and established wild populations throughout the outskirts of Mumbai. These images were captured with night vision cameras. They are spectacular. And I'll show you the full video here shortly. But essentially, these urban pigs and the leopards that prey upon them are winners in this human-dominated world. Finally, in this lecture, we'll explore interspecific interactions. Inter means across, so these are interactions across different species. For example, competition. Great example of a negative interspecific interaction. Here's competition between gray wolves and the formidable grizzly bear in Yellowstone National Park. So they're competing over this limited resource of ungulate carcasses. This should be a fun one. To begin with, each mammalian species occupies one or maybe more than one habitats. Each species has certain physical and chemical environmental tolerances. For example, temperature ranges within which the species can tolerate. And finally, each species performs a specific role in the community. In other words, each species can be characterized by its own unique ecological niche. Joseph Grinnell, who worked with both birds and mammals in the early 1900s, was one of the first ecologists to use the term the niche, by which he meant the habitat that a species occupies as a function of its physiological and behavioral attributes. Then in 1927, Elton is going to expand upon this idea and include the organism's functional role in the community in terms of its trophic or feeding level, such as an organism being a primary consumer like this agouti, or an apex predator like the leopards on the last slide. Today, most ecologists include both the distributional, meaning the habitat requirements, the physiological constraints, as well as the functional components. Is the animal an herbivore, a carnivore? Is it a seed disperser? In considering the species niche. So most ecologists are going to consider the niche the total suite of adaptations of a species to a particular environment. As ecologists never know all of the parameters necessary to define a niche completely, they tend to emphasize the limiting factors, the factors that limit where the species is found, as well as its overall abundance, its population size. And they identify those resources for which the organisms compete and are typically limiting. For example, last module we discussed the agoutis, pictured here. They're rodents, and it turns out that these agoutis have this outsized impact on the community structure of tropical rainforests in Central America. So big seeds, like those shown here from Barro, Colorado Island in Panama, were probably once ingested and then defecated whole by huge elephant-like mammals called gomphotheres that disperse the seeds over large distances. But gomphotheres were hunted into extinction at the end of the Pleistocene 10,000 years ago. So why didn't all of these large-seeded tropical plants go extinct? Well, it turns out that agoutis stepped up and filled that niche. They took over that seed dispersing role of the gomphotheres, moving seeds at scales never imagined by researchers until they got some of these guys GPS collared. But before we get too far along, let's return to Mumbai. So please put me on pause and check out this stunning footage of urban leopards hunting by exploiting the ceaseless noise of the massive city of Mumbai while clueless teenagers stroll about. So check this out, please. Ecological relationships between two or more different species are known as interspecific interactions. Similarly, intraspecific interactions are interactions among individuals of the same species. So think about males competing for access to females. Those are intraspecific interactions. On your final assessment, you will be responsible for distinguishing between the following types of interspecific interactions: competition, predation, parasitism, commensualism, mutualism, commensualism, and facilitation. As we examine these relationships, we will summarize the interactions with plus signs when the species benefits from the interaction, as well as minus signs when the species is harmed, and then finally the not sign, the zero, when the species isn't really affected by the interaction. It's a neutral impact. Interspecific competition occurs when two different species have overlapping niches, meaning different species are going to compete for some limiting resource. In this case, it's cheetahs and hyenas that are competing over the antelope carcass. Important to note, both species are harmed by this competition, i.e., competition is always a negative interaction. It could be negative because the competitor loses access to the resource. So maybe the cheetah loses the carcass. But regardless of whoever gets the carcass, both species are harmed from the competition in the sense that they're both having to expend energy to compete with each other to access the resource, as well as risking injury in defending that resource. So competition may be exploitive. So maybe it's a race between pigs and sun bears in forests in Indonesia to see who can gobble up the most figs during mass fruiting events. Or competition can be deemed interference competition. For example, the hyena appears to be preventing the cheetahs from accessing this resource. We're going to come back to territoriality, a type of interference competition, in lesson 6.3 this week. The videos in this lecture are really some of my faves. I really hope you enjoy them. So here's some amazing footage that was captured of a grizzly bear in Yellowstone that's defending what's most likely an elk carcass from a very large and hungry pack of wolves that are quite determined. So it's a great example of negative interspecific competition as these two species are wasting energy and risking injury competing for this limited but prized resource. So this is an important concept here. The fundamental niche represents where the species could exist in a perfect world, freed from the constraints of competition. Your book defines the fundamental niche as the full range of environmental conditions and resources in which a species can maintain a viable population in a given region in the absence of competition. So it's where the species could exist and the resources the species could exploit if no other species competed with it. But animals live in the real world. The realized niche is where the species actually exists, given that it lives in a world with competitors, other species that are after that same limited resource. Thus, the realized niche is defined as a narrower, a restricted range that the species occupies in the presence of competing species, where some habitats or resources are not available because they're occupied by competitors. So I've actually thought quite a bit about fundamental versus realized niches in pumas, or mountain lions, cougars, panthers, catamounts, whatever you want to call them. In 2017, I co-authored a paper with colleagues from the South Dakota Game, Fish, and Parks, so the state agency in South Dakota. We demonstrated a greatly enlarged fundamental niche in pumas or mountain lions in the Black Hills of South Dakota. In the Black Hills, there are no brown or black bears, and there are no wolves. So pumas have much less competition hunting for elk, specifically elk calves. In the absence of other apex predators, these dedicated South Dakota biologists observed pumas coming down out of the higher elevation coniferous forests and hunting elk calving grounds in the sagebrush flats. As I'll cover next module, we never had elk calves killed in the sagebrush when I did similar work in Montana. The cats didn't get the elk calves until later in the summer when they moved up into the ponderosa pines at higher elevation. But in South Dakota, the pumas have experienced competitive release. They are freed from the competition of bears and wolves by their extirpation. And so the breadth of the puma has expanded to include this new hunting ground, hunting in sagebrush flats. And it gives us a window into what is possible in the fundamental niche of the mountain lion. The paper is up in Canvas if you're interested in reading the primary manuscript, and please reach out to me if you have any questions about this study or others that I've included. If the competition is strong enough, then a species' realized niche can become so small that it results in the localized extirpation of that losing species. So this outcome was formalized as the competitive exclusion principle by Gauss in 1934. And it states that two species cannot coexist for long on a single limiting resource. Or, put more simply, that complete competitors, when the entire niche of two species completely overlaps, they cannot coexist indefinitely. A nice example of competitive exclusion that I found in the primary literature was documented by Head et al. In 2012. In Loango National Park in Gabon, chimpanzees were excluded by the forest elephants when fruit availability was low. Elephants proved to be just too efficient at gobbling up the little available fruit that there was. Whereas gorillas were excluded by forest elephants in areas where there was low herbaceous density. There wasn't a lot of herbs, even though there was high fruit availability, which makes sense because gorillas, as we know, are more frugivorous as opposed to frugivorous. Ultimately, if two competing species are to coexist for any length of time in a stable environment, then they must differentiate their realized niches. As you can see here in this top figure, figure A, we've got three hypothetical species, and the distributions of the seeds that they're focused on is shifting away from one another. So species A is focused on smaller seed sizes, whereas species C is focused on larger seed sizes. In doing so, they're minimizing niche overlap and they're minimizing competition, which is negative for all species involved. Ultimately, if no differentiation takes place, like you see here in figure B, then one species will exclude the others. We see this a lot. It's especially true on islands with smaller land areas, smaller resource bases, at least compared to the continental mainland. So I used to live here on Prince of Wales Island in a small coastal community called Thorn Bay when I worked for Alaska Fish and Game. On Prince of Wales Island, as well as all of the islands in southeast Alaska that are south of this red line, there are lots of black bears. We would see black bears almost every day in the field, as well as the Alexander Archipelago gray wolf. But there are no grizzly bears in these southern islands, just black bears and gray wolves. However, if you go north of this red line to what the locals call the ABC Islands, Admiralty, Baranof, and Chichagof Islands, we find grizzly bears, very large-bodied grizzly bears, closely related to polar bears. But no black bears and no gray wolves on the ABC Islands. So here, the grizzly bear has outcompeted the smaller-bodied apex predators, whereas down south in these warmer islands, the smaller-bodied community here of apex predators, the black bear and the gray wolf, has outcompeted the grizzly bear. Really cool brown bear observatory is here on Admiralty Island. I highly recommend it. You can get up close watching non-habituated brown bears feed on salmon. It's called Pack Creek, and it's on Admiralty Island. Email me, reach out to me if you have questions about Pack Creek. Cool brown bear observatory. When the ranges of two similar species overlap, that is to say, their ranges are sympatric, the species tend to differ more from each other in their morphological characteristics than they do when their ranges do not overlap, when they're allopatrically distributed. So this shifting of morphological traits has been referred to as character displacement. So a good example, in Northern Europe, where the Eurasian pygmy shrew on the left here and the common shrew on the right overlap extensively, the pygmy shrew has a significantly smaller lower jaw than it does on the islands off the coasts of England and Sweden, where the populations of the two species of shrew are allopatric. So you can see it here. So here's where the species overlap. They're both found, both the pygmy and the common shrew are distributed in the same habitat, and you can see here's the mode for skull width right here, whereas here in a system where there are only pygmy shrews, skull width has shifted larger. Skull size is related to prey size. That is, individuals with larger skulls can eat larger prey than those with smaller skulls. The inference is that in zones of overlap, like we see up top here, the pygmy shrew is specializing on smaller prey, ultimately leading to reduced competition and the higher probability of the coexistence of both species over time with this character displacement. Moving on from competition, which is negative for both species involved, we'll next focus on predation, which usually involves the interactions between trophic levels, where one species benefits, obviously the predator, the jaguar in this instance, to the detriment of another species, the prey, like the capybara here. Predation is defined as occurring when individuals consume all or part of other formerly live animals. There are actually 4 types of predation, and we'll go over each now. Number 1, herbivory is actually a form of predation which occurs when animals consume green plants, which of course are alive, or their seeds or fruit as their prey. Generally, herbivores are not going to kill the plants. However, seed predators, like this squirrel, are obviously killing the potential oak tree when they eat their acorns. Number 2, parasitism occurs when one species, the parasite, feeds on another, the host, which it usually does not kill. So that's the big difference between parasitism and carnivory, which I'll cover next, when the predator actually eats the prey and kills it. Parasites are usually much smaller than the host, as is the case with the vampire bat dining on the blood of this domestic pig. The third type of predation, the one that you're probably first to imagine, is termed carnivory. In this case, the predator is going to kill and eat the prey, as exemplified here by this beautiful African leopard who is bringing his or her prey, her impala, up into a tree for safekeeping away from those pesky hyenas. And since we're talking leopards, how about some footage of the elusive snow leopard hunting? So be sure and watch at least the last minute or so of this footage. It is a remarkable chase scene in some really extreme terrain. So please check it out. And lastly, the fourth type of predation is cannibalism. This is where the predator and the prey are the same species, and therefore they're part of the same trophic level. We see cannibalism regularly in the lions. This is an African lion here. When a new male or a small group of males takes over a pride of lionesses, they kill all of the cubs that they didn't sire. So nature is red in tooth and claw, as the poet Alfred Lord Tennyson wrote. Predators can respond to changes in the density of their prey by two primary mechanisms. First, they can change their behavior, like switching to a new prey species when their primary prey densities get quite low, termed the functional response. Or the population of predators can actually change in numbers themselves through reproduction, immigration, emigration, which is termed the numerical response. The three types of functional or behavioral responses of predators to changes in prey density was first described by Holling in 1959. So in a type 1 predator response, the predators are simply going to consume more prey as the density of prey increases. So the x-axis here showing density of prey increasing, and predators are simply consuming more and more of these prey. It's a linear model. But as you probably guessed, this isn't very realistic because predators become satiated, right? They get full. So that satiation is represented by the type 2 functional response, where we see this inflection in the curve here. So predators are going to increase their consumption of prey as the prey density increases up until they're limited by satiation or time constraints, right? It takes time to actually catch and consume prey. Type 3 shows prey switching. So at low densities, the predator really isn't focused on that prey item. They're focused on other prey that they're more likely to encounter. However, once prey density crosses a certain threshold, then suddenly the consumption rates of that prey is going to rapidly increase. So, for example, maybe the salmon begin their annual spawning in southeast Alaska, and once the salmon arrive, then the grizzly bears switch prey and come in to start fishing for salmon. Another really important concept in community ecology is that of the keystone species. Like the keystone that keeps the archway from tumbling down, some species appear to play critical roles in ecological communities. Simply put, not all species are created equal. As noted way back in Module 1, although mammals typically only account for a small fraction of the biomass and the energy flow in most ecosystems, they are often the keystone species, regulating the structure and the dynamics of the entire ecological community. The textbook definition of a keystone species is one whose functional role in a community is disproportionately greater than predicted by their abundance alone. Small numbers, but a very outsized impact. So further, the removal of a keystone species is going to have a large effect on community composition, biodiversity, as well as the functionality of the entire system. As you learned at the beginning of this course, the eradication of the gray wolf from the Intermountain West, including Yellowstone National Park, allowed for the dramatic increase in elk abundance in the northern Yellowstone herd, and it also allowed these elk to forage without fear in riparian areas, thereby decimating the recruitment of new stands of aspen and willow and alder, which then negatively impacted the ecosystem engineer, the beaver, and resulted in a whole host of trophic cascades, which we've already explored. Keystone species are often apex or top predators like gray wolves, but not always. As shown here, the African Savannah elephant will knock over entire trees to get access to their leaves, as well as forage on the bark, essentially girdling trees, killing them and causing the loss of woodlands and the creation of the savanna, of those really important grasslands. Once that forest canopy is opened up, it's a positive feedback loop which accelerates the fire process. So in large parts of sub-Saharan Africa, the vegetation has shifted away from woodland-dominated systems to those of grasslands as a result of this single species, the African savanna elephant. And this is advantageous for a whole host of other grazing ungulates. Elephants, truly a keystone species. The most famous example of a trophic cascade, that is to say, the pervasive, widespread ecosystem disruptions that are caused by the removal of a keystone species, was carefully documented and then systematically, empirically tested by the famous Robert Payne, and that famous publication came out in 1980. In short, in areas where sea otters were absent, the impact of unchecked sea urchin populations altered the entire ecosystem to a state change away from kelp forests, which ultimately results in lower biodiversity and fewer trophic interactions. And then it was James Estes who puzzled out what was happening to sea otter populations, at least in some areas. But I don't want to give this story away. Your Module 6 assignment is simply beautifully done. It's a story of field work at its best, and it's one that all of you budding new ecologists should know intimately. So take some time and enjoy Some Animals Are More Equal Than Others, Keystone Species, and Trophic Cascades. Really good film. Interactions in which both species benefit. They're plus plus. The benefits can either be direct or indirect, is deemed mutualism. Simply put, mutualism is defined as cooperation between two different species. Examples of direct mutualism in which both species are in contact and benefit include seed dispersal by rodents, like those agoutis that we've talked about, pollination of many plant species by mammalian bats. Many of our cacti here in the Sonoran Desert are bat pollinated. The removal of ectoparasites by birds like this beautiful oxpecker from larger species like the mammalian zebra here. And then lastly, the digestion of cellulose by the endosymbionts that live within the rumens of ungulates. Here's a wonderful example of mutualism. It's a warthog cleaning station where mongoose are going to dine on fat ticks, getting a nice high caloric protein treat. And the warthog is getting cleaned of its ectoparasites. Fun little clip, so be sure and check that one out for me. Lastly, commensual relationships are won when one species benefits and the other species is more or less unaffected. Meh. So the barnacles, they're getting a free ride here. They're benefiting. They're getting a substrate to attach to on this baleen whale. But the whale, it's not really impacted all that much by these little tag-alongs. And with that, I'll wrap up 6.1. Got some big names in ecology on this list. So Pionka, Hutchinson, Robert Payne, James Estes. Hopefully you recognize some of those. Next up, carnivores. Tune in.